So we, of course, are very aware of the results of the U.S. midterms. In the U.S. political system, the negotiating partner is the USTR and its leader, Ambassador Lighthizer. He was our counterparty for negotiating the agreement. And as I think Canadians know very well, on the 30th of September, we reached an agreement in principle with the U.S. and Mexico. In terms of the ratification process going forward in the United States, that is very much a domestic issue for the Americans, just as our own ratification process is a domestic issue for us. And just as I don't think Canadians would really welcome U.S. involvement in our domestic ratification, I don't think that it's appropriate for us to get involved in that U.S. domestic process. Having said that, one of our key interests in this negotiation was an updated labor chapter with stronger labor protections. This agreement has the strongest labor chapter of any trade agreement Canada has ever concluded. And Canada has the highest labor standards of anywhere in North America. So we're always in favor of high ambition in labor guarantees in our trade agreements. That's good for Canadian workers, and we always support what's good for Canadian workers.
You said in your remarks that this wasn't just any deal, but a good deal for Canadians. Not here in Port Colborne, but in the neighboring town of Welland, which I'm sure MP Thataway is aware of. There's a steel company, ASW, and they're getting clobbered by the tariffs going both ways. They produce raw steel here, it gets shipped to the U.S., it gets tariffed, it comes back as processed steel, it gets tariffed again. So what do you say to those steel manufacturers, particularly in Canada, who find themselves squeezed effectively in this trade tussle between Canada and the United States? And how is this deal good for them when they have to, their costs go up, their number of employees go down, so on and so forth?
Well, what I have to say to Canadian steel workers and Canadian steel companies is we support you 1,000%. I had a very good meeting with leaders from the steel industry in Toronto last Friday, and we are 100% supportive of the Canadian steel industry when it comes to the U.S. 232 tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum. What Canada said from day one, when these tariffs were first being mooted in the United States, is that they were unjustified, that they were illegal, and frankly, that they were absurd. We have to remember the 232 section, which justifies the levying of these tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, is a national security consideration. So the argument being made is that Canadian steel and aluminum somehow poses a national security threat to the United States. We think that is patently absurd. And I think looking around here, see all the work that all these guys are doing for U.S. companies. We are not a strategic threat to the United States. We are a strategic partner. And Canada has made that point, is making that point in legal challenges to the 232 tariffs. We are challenging them at the WTO and at NAFTA tribunals. And crucially, because these tariffs were so absurd, Canada took the very strong step of introducing our own retaliatory measures in response. Canada's retaliation was measured, it was perfectly reciprocal, and it will remain in place until the U.S. lifts its tariffs. Now, what we say to our American partners is having these tariffs on both sides is not good for anybody. And there is a very simple answer, which is both countries should lift their tariffs. I'm ready to do it this afternoon. I have been taking a lot of comfort from the voices we are hearing in the United States, increasingly making exactly that same argument. Today, the ITC in the U.S. is holding hearings on the modernized NAFTA. And one of the points which U.S. companies speaking at those hearings have been making is the damage that the 232 tariffs and the Canadian retaliation are doing, not to us, but to the United States. And there have been a number of people just today at the ITC hearings calling on the U.S. administration to lift the 232 tariffs on Canada. And I would just say I support that 100%.
And for those companies that are caught in the middle, like ASW and
Well, we have, and I was actually discussing with Victor earlier today, our government is very supportive of the Canadian companies, of the Canadian workers, which are targeted by these illegal and unjustified tariffs. That's why we have put a number of programs in place to support Canadian companies, the duty drawback programs, the safeguards, and we are very keen to work with Canadian companies to help them get through this. This is absolutely an illegal and unjustified action, and the Government of Canada is there for Canadian companies.
The United States announced that they will be sanctioning 17 Saudis for their role in killing of Jamal Khashoggi. Will Canada be taking the similar actions at all?
We are very aware of the U.S. sanctions on certain Saudi individuals, and we have been in close contact with the U.S. about those Magnitsky sanctions. Canada welcomes the U.S. action. When it comes to Canada, we also do have Magnitsky legislation in place, and that is a tool which we have found very useful in our foreign policy. And that is certainly something which, in the coming days, Canada is actively considering.
I have another question for my Radio Canada colleague. He says, there are reports today in the press about several attacks in Canada by Russian trolls. Are you concerned that these trolls are trying to influence public opinion in this country? And if so, what is being done about it?
So I am unfamiliar with those specific reports. Having said that, I think that it is no secret to any Canadians that there have in the past been active Russian efforts to interfere with the functioning of democratic politics in leading Western democracies. It would be naive of us to think that Canada could somehow be immune to those actions. Our government is very mindful of how precious our democracy is and of the absolute imperative to protect and defend our democracy from malign foreign actors. So it's something we are very mindful of. My colleagues Ralph Goodale and Karina Gould are very involved, and it's something that we work on with our partners in the G7, in NATO, on.
Just one last question, Minister.
No problem.
The CBC reported today that part of what went into the negotiations of the trade deal was effectively leave steel and aluminum as it is, situation as it is, in order to protect the Canadian auto sector from further reprisals from the United States. Have you seen that report yet today, and do you care to comment on it?
I haven't seen that report, but let me make a couple more comments on Section 232. Our position from the very outset, from the first time that the U.S. started talking about the Section 232 steel and aluminum action, was to make very clear to the U.S. and to the world that the Section 232 consideration and the NAFTA talks were entirely separate issues and on entirely separate tracks. And that is not just a matter of opinion, that is a matter of law. Section 232 has no legitimate part in a trade negotiation. It is not a market access discussion. Section 232 can only be used by the U.S. when it makes the case that it is facing a national security threat. And we were very clear to put issues like that into the NAFTA discussion would be entirely inappropriate. So we have kept them very separate from the start. I do want to reiterate, though, that we are very clear as well. Not only is the imposition of the Section 232 steel and aluminum tariffs on Canada unjustified, illegal, and absurd, it is every bit as harmful to the United States as it is to Canada. And what we are seeing and what we welcome is mounting voices in the United States talking about the absurdity of the steel and aluminum tariffs on Canada. We're hearing that from the business community. We are hearing that from trade unions. We are hearing that from legislators. In fact, as part of the ITC hearings on the new NAFTA today, one of the observations made by Americans was that it would make no sense for the U.S. to ratify the new agreement without lifting the steel and aluminum tariffs, in part because the new rules of origin for cars that we agreed in the updated NAFTA specify a certain level of North American steel. So if this agreement specifies that we need to be using North American steel in cars to qualify for the NAFTA rules of origin, it's kind of absurd to be imposing tariffs on Canadian steel. And I really hasten to add that this is not an argument that I am making. I am quoting Americans speaking in the U.S. hearing on our updated agreement. And that is really common sense. When we introduced our retaliation in response to the U.S. steel and aluminum tariffs, one of the things the Prime Minister said that day when we made our announcement is that he was confident that in the end, common sense would prevail and the tariffs would be lifted. And I'm confident that that is the case too.